Hey Internet, we're bringing this Cogboy Cogitation to you from this brand new world. Emmanuel and I are both sitting at home chatting over Discord. And so to bring this video to you, what we'll be doing is talking through some situations, and instead of the normal videos where you're seeing us actually move models around on the board, we'll be doing this talk and then taking some images, which you'll be seeing, to illustrate what we're talking about. And so stay safe, everyone. And now Emmanuel, take it away.
Thanks, Alex. So we've gotten quite a few requests to talk a little bit about the nuances of movement, specifically in the fight phase. With so much of the battle round taken up by movement and shooting, particularly movement, the fight phase is oftenly overlooked or even rushed. There's a very common phrase that's uttered in those previous two phases called, or where people say, locked in combat, and it eventually starts to bleed into our subconscious that, yeah, these models are locked, but the state that they're in is not static. It's a lot more fluid than that leads you to believe.
There's a lot of nuance to the movement in the fight phase and the charges leading into that, as just as much as there is in shooting, demonstrated in our previous video of Take the Shot. And so we just want to cover a lot of these nuances, how to optimize your charges and how to develop good habits and what to look for in order to just optimize all this extra movement that is often overlooked.
And even though this happens in the fight phase, it's enabled in the movement phase. Just like all your shots that you take are all enabled and all the modifiers are enabled in that movement phase. Again, harkening back to how important the movement phase is to this game. Generally speaking, combat happens only if you enter into combat through a charge. There are a couple situations, such as like failing a fall test and ending up within an inch of an enemy model. That's a weird thing that no one ever does. But also some of the stuff that we're going to talk about later are other ways that you can end up in combat with another model. But for simplicity's sake, while we're talking about movement phase, that's going to be specifically just movement phase and charges to get into combat. And since there isn't so much to talk about charging to necessitate a whole other video for it, we want to do a quick aside before we actually get into pile-in and consolidation moves, just to talk about charges specifically.
So charging can seem riskier than it actually is in a lot of circumstances. So when you declare the charge and you're looking at the models you're going to charge, and if they can see you, you often think, oh no, I'm giving them overwatch. I'm giving these guys free shots. And it is a concern. It absolutely is. But a lot of times, eating those shots where they're hitting you on sixes is a lot better than giving them the chance to, shoot on their baseline ballistic skill. To say nothing of getting buffed from, whether it's comms or omnispexes or whatever other nastiness they're able to throw on their shooting. Eating shots hitting you on a six is usually better. And you can be concerned about failing a charge. So, you go for your charge, you whiff it, and you stand around with your hands in your pockets, letting someone shoot you.
Yeah, sometimes out in the open, too.
Yeah, it's not great.
No. And the one thing to add to that is that there are certain situations that you need to be aware of, and this is knowing your opponent, knowing your opponent's roster and their models, to be a little wary of auto-hitting weapons or certain abilities, sub-factions, or tactics that can improve that Overwatch shooting. So that's something to be aware of when you're taking those gambles of making that charge and potentially giving an extra shot to a model. Movement and positioning is pretty key to setting up that good charge. At least of most is at least giving your model obscurement. It's not going to give you any benefit to the modifiers for their hit rolls, because those are going to be sixes in most situations anyway. But if you can at least be within 1 inch of obscurement, that if you get down to the injury roll, you're going to have a better chance of at least suffering a flesh wound and still making it into combat, which can be the only goal of that model. And it's important to note that obscurement doesn't have to come from terrain specifically. You could get that obscurement by being within 1 inch of one of your own ally models and charge around that guy and actually get a benefit of obscurement and a benefit on your injury roll for that. Also, making sure that you're out of range of auto-hitting weapons, being at that magic 8.1 inches of flamers and frag cannons, can spare you a lot of hurt with that auto-hit charge and force them to have to roll those 6s. And as I alluded to before, sometimes those cheaper models, the only purpose they have is just to get into combat and actually not do anything when they're there. So having armies with a lot of gaunts or a lot of boys, you can use those cheaper models as chaff just to get in there and allow other models which would have had a riskier Overwatch to have to suffer to be able to just walk into that combat. That positioning often takes place the round before. So you need to be thinking in the fourth dimension when you're making those moves, especially in that battle round 1, of where your opponent likely is going to be, or where you think they're going to be, or where they actually are if you're lucky enough to be second in initiative, and make your movement decisions, not only considering obscurity in shooting phase, but also thinking forward to that next charge and the suite of charges you're going to be making.
A lot of this discussion thus far has been about, if kind of with the intent of using your charges to kill, to take more.
Isn't that what you're supposed to do?
Well, yes, but one thing, as someone who, so Emmanuel uses he's a fight phase army. He plays Evil Sun's orcs, and he that's how he wins. He wins in the fight phase. I oftentimes will use infiltrators as more of a roadblock. So sometimes I look at charging sort of as a sacrifice. And so, sometimes boys will be bearing down on my gun line, and I'll throw one model from the gun line into a couple boys, not so much with the intent to try to kill them in combat, but with the goal of charging them in and locking them up. And then with, hopefully, miraculously, my little Skitari will manage to live. And then he can fall back the next turn, and then those two boys can't charge because they started a model, or they had a model within an inch of them at the beginning of the movement phase. So they're just kind of a hose. They're just hanging out to dry. So don't just think about charging with the intent of using it to hurt. Well, you think about it with the intent of using it to your opponent's disadvantage. But that advantage does not necessarily have to be to take models out of action. There are other nuances that you can use it for as well.
Yeah, I hate it when you do that. So a lot of these positioning nuances and decisions and how to charge and when to charge and with who to charge, oftentimes just kind of, you learn it by playing and playing and playing. The more games you go through, the more of these nuances will kind of bubble to the surface. So we won't go through that in any more detail, but we do want to start talking about pile-in and consolidation. So it starts in the movement phase, but really these decisions only start if you have ample movement on your charge. So let's assume that you make the charge. If you make the minimum, you're 8 inches away and you roll a 7, you're done. You have no decisions to make. You just end up the closest you can get within 1 inch of that enemy model, and you're done. But if you roll more than the minimum, you have to think forward towards what you could accomplish with a pile-in and a consolidation to know where you should place that model. Should you be a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left? Should you base to base with that model? Those are the decisions you make knowing the pile-in consolidation. The only other thing that would factor into where you would position after a charge is if you're going up against a psyker. Because if you're in combat with a psyker, where you position after that charge is going to determine who is a valid target for their Cybolt. So that's the only thing other than pile-in consolidation that would matter when you have more than enough to use on that successful charge.
And the one thing to add to this is always roll your charges.
Oh, for sure.
We are all guilty of looking at a charge and saying, oh, they're 2 inches away. I'm not going to bother. And you just nudge your model into combat. No, always roll. You never know what's going to happen when you roll that double 6 on your charge and then have the entire world as your oyster. You may be trying to nudge in kind of blocking you out of a hallway. But with a 12-inch charge, you may be able to run out the one hallway you're currently in, run around to the other hallway he's in, and come around back down the other side of it, and all of a sudden end up on the far side of it. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it can happen, and it's a good habit to be in, because if you're in that habit of always rolling, at some point this situation will occur, and you'll go, oh, that's going to stink for you.
So you're in the charge. You're safe from shooting, which is my favorite place to be. Now we're into the combat phase. So the best place to start in explaining this is going over a few rules definitions. And not even the pilot and consolidation move definition first. It starts a little further back, and at the bottom of the first page of the fight phase in the core manual, the phrasing of who is eligible to fight. It is models who have successfully charged, and that means declare a charge and end up within 1 inch of those models. Those are only models that have, that satisfies the criteria of successfully charged. Were themselves charged by that same definition successfully, or are within 1 inch of an enemy model. Not at the start of the phase, but at the time of the model activation.
Yeah, and I think the model the eligibility is determined at model activation time, which I think is a big deal that a lot of people kind of forget.
Because it's different from movement phase. Because movement phase, it starts at the beginning of movement phase, whether you're in combat or not. But in combat phase, it's at the time of model activation, which is how some models later on can then become eligible if they themselves get piled in or consolidated on, when they weren't eligible at the beginning of the phase. So that's why it's important to make that distinction.
Definitely.
But the most important one out of these three, sorry to cut you off, Alex, but the most important one of these three criteria is that second one, were themselves charged? Because this sets up a situation where you can be outside of combat, but then use the pile-in move to get into combat and fight someone. It's important to distinguish between this situation and a situation of someone who made a charge and then loses its target. So set up the situation where a model charges into two separate models. And multiple charges happen, and both of those models that the original model charged into vanish. They successfully charged, so they then can pile in, but if they pile into another model, they can't attack at that point because the models that they charged are gone. And by the charge rules, they can only attack models that they successfully charged. But if you're in the situation where you were charged into, and then the model that charged into you is now gone, you can then pile in because you satisfy that second criteria of having been charged. You can pile in, and if you pile in within 1 inch of an enemy model, you can actually fight because you're not under the successfully charged criteria because you were yourself charged. So even though both of these situations allow you to make a pile-in move, in one situation you can acquire new targets, where in the previous situation where you were the charging model, you cannot.
So now that we've covered eligibility, now comes the nuance, and the point of this is the movement. So pile in and consolidate are where a lot of interesting things happen. So both of these types of movement are virtually the same. One is just pile in is the very first thing you do in your fight sequence. Consolidate's the very last thing. But they're both exactly the same in the sense that you can move up to 3 inches so long as you end up closer to the nearest enemy model.
And it's closer and nearest, which are the things that you can play around with the most. And I think you're about to get into that, Alex.
Well, you're the master of this. I think you ought to bring everyone through this.
I don't know. I think we both crumped a lot in our lifetimes, also in Kill Team. But so you start off with reviewing the eligibility to fight to know if you can then activate, and then you make the movement. So the first step is pile in. Now, as long as you end up closer, that's all that matters. So it's not directly towards. You see a lot of players moving with their pile in only directly towards the model. While that's correct, it's not your only option. If you end up a millimeter closer, but you moved sideways, that's still a legal move. And the other thing to point out about these moves is that in no way does it say you cannot move within 1 inch of models that you didn't charge or anything like that, because these movements are other ways to penetrate that 1 inch bubble to get into combat. So it's completely free movement. You need to, when you're choosing this model and you're making your decision to do the pile in, you have to think about the intent of what that pile in is going to accomplish for you. Are you getting a better position for combat? Do you want to acquire a new target? Say like you lost your original target for combat because of psychic phase or flesh hooks or a pistol shot, or someone else crumped the guy you were about to crump. You can then pile in towards another enemy model and then start crumping, right? You can include additional models into combat. Say you want to fight someone else that you weren't within combat, but you could shimmy around a little bit to get within 1 inch and then attack someone else. Completely feasible, even if you already have a target. Or you can even use your pile in, or later even a consolidate, to tiptoe towards tiptoe into combat with a model that you would never want to charge in your life, like that frag can and Death Watch. So it's able to at least get into combat and tie up or even fight with models that you would rather not charge into to get into combat. You can also use these movements for positioning, to either get onto an objective, dip your toe into that 2 inch bubble on an objective. You can shimmy around a barrier so that way you could fight someone and not have a -1 to your hit modifier if you were fighting above that barrier. Or the opposite, you can use your consolidate to get on the other side of a barrier to then make it more difficult for them to hit you if they can't make the same pile in move to get closer to you. And finally, you can use this positioning, and we'll touch on this at the end, to change your opponent's ability to make the pile-ins and consolidation moves that they would want to. We'll spend some more time on that because that one's a little different.
So we're gonna roll into some, now that we've gone over the rules themselves, we're gonna talk a little bit about specific examples of what you can do with this. And I'm gonna say the ruling again, and I know that you guys might be annoyed, but it bears repeating because it's super important. Your model must end up its 3 inch move, whether pile in or consolidate. It must end its 3 inch move closer to the nearest enemy model. So there's the one that we all do. You charge someone in just as close as, you go as close as you can with your charge, and then you say, I don't want you to move. So you just go ahead and consolidate or pile in directly into them, go base to base, and then because they cannot end up closer to you than they already are, they are not allowed to do any pile in or consolidate either. And so we all call that basing. Everyone's pretty familiar with that. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But there's some more interesting maneuvers that you can also do with it as well.
Yeah, so if you leave like a hair distance at the end of your charge, just like a hair, that allows you to then pile in and then base your opponents, but that gives you the tightest arc around that model in that 3 inches. So just leaving just a hair instance, and in this situation, I would probably be courteous to your opponent and just mention, hey, so I'm leaving a little bit of room here. I'm not based, just so that way there's no argument later. But that again, that's another one of those obvious examples.
And just as an aside for declaring intent, I think declaring intent's really important in the fight phase. Just because you've got a whole bunch of models really close to each other. We are humans. We are imprecise. We're going to bump models. And someone's model is going to end up based or not based when that wasn't the intention. And then if you just tell your opponent when you're moving, then the fight phase starts, and then you're looking at models and going, oh wait, no, that wasn't. And because you told your opponent what your intent was, they go, oh yeah, of course. And then you guys reset it to what it should be, and everyone's happy. So the really crazy one is the slingshot.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you declare your charge and you've got a couple enemies. So you declare a charge onto 2 enemies. You can't quite make it to the second one, but you get to the first one. So you end up just inside an inch. We're going to call it almost exactly 1 inch away from it. You do your pile-in. Now you do your pile-in, and you've got your 3 inches, and with those 3 inches, you're able to get within 1 inch of your second model that you charged. Fantastic. But let's say that you managed to get within half an inch of that second model, but you managed to leave yourself just 0.9 inches away from that first model. You do your attacks. We move through everything. Let's say that both models are still standing at the end of the day, which is sad, but it happens. Now, your consolidate move is actually going to be towards the second model, because your consolidate move is towards the nearest enemy model, just at the time of the consolidate. It's nothing about at the start of your activation. It is at that exact point in time. So in this maneuver, you can actually slingshot around the first model and then slingshot around and then keep moving around the second model, and get just these 6 inches of crazy free movement that no one is expecting you to do.
Yeah, it's a little wobbly 6 inches, but it's really neat. So just to end, and we'll go through it just one more time because this is so complicated. You're within 1 inch of enemy 1. You pile in and end up 0.9 inches to enemy 1, which is a legal move for pile in. But in doing that move, you're now half an inch away from enemy 2, which then your consolidation is then towards enemy 2, not enemy 1. And this can be something that can catch your opponent off guard, but it's completely legal. And then that can even get you so far away from enemy 1 that they can't even fight you back.
Yeah, depending on exactly what the game state looks like, yeah, it's absolutely possible to consolidate out of combat, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Or consolidate so far away that you're no longer the closest target to them anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And so then, I think that kind of leads us into thinking ahead.
Yeah.
And planning, before you actually make your pile-ins and consolidates, what to do.
Yeah, because it's not only just about the combat that you're doing right now, but kind of like what the what the slingshot segues into is you're accomplishing something later on in the match by piling and consolidates now, like you were about to say, Alex.
We've got several examples of this too. So the slingshot, with these, wiggly 6 inches of movement, you can end up hopping on an objective that your opponent thought you were, there's no way he's getting to that until the next turn, even if, he manages to kill this model. But, unluckily for them, you don't even have to cap a model. It's very possible for you to just wiggle your way across the board and all of a sudden end up on.
And then something near and dear to my heart would be planning for the next charge. If you, depending on the board state, you might see another model that you want to charge into, but it's kind of open. Even if you kill your current target, you can't pile in all the way or consolidate all the way over there. But you can choose your pile in movement to ensure that if you kill your target, you would consolidate in a direction that would get you into either complete obscurity or at least some sort of obscurity to enable your next charge attempt to be more optimal.
And kind of looping back into what we were first discussing with the charge phase. So it just kind of compounds from one turn into the next.
It's all a dance. And then a particularly fun trick to do is this kind of slingshot combat. We refer to slingshotting as kind of weaving around and going from one model to another with your consolidation and pile in. Flip that, reverse that. But you can also use this as a way to kind of leapfrog your combat from one model to the next without actually having to risk any overwatch from charges at all. So you can choose to make your consolidation after you take care of a target and go within 1 inch of your next target, and then leave the rest of your guys outside that 1 inch with their pile-ins and end their activation there, allowing them to charge in, even if you need to, with a decisive move, to lock that next model into combat, and then have that initiative or that bump up in that initiative order by having charged models. Also, if you're going for something like a vicious assault, a charge-related positional secondary in a lot of the ITC packets, that can also guarantee a very safe way to achieve that. Obviously, you need more than one model in the fight in order to accomplish that, but something that I'm a little bit more accustomed to with my boys.
Definitely. My view of charging is often, you know, designated to take out single threats or prevent a particular thing from happening. But when you have the melee focus faction, you know, you gotta chain these things together rather than kind of looking at it turn to turn in isolation.
That's how the green tide flows.
Yeah. Kind of riffing off that, if you don't have a particular goal from piling and consolidating, like if you're just, you know, trying to move block with a charge or protect something rather than, you know, continue leapfrogging forward more and more, it's important to understand what your opponent's goals or objectives are and to try to deny that with these pile-ins and consolidates. So, you know, perhaps, you know, from my perspective, I charge someone and know that, hey, you know, he's going to try to slingshot around me so he can get closer to my squishy gun line for his next turn. So I might use my pile-in or consolidate to try to swing around and block someone from being able to swing through and get move in a certain position, either by, you know, physically blocking or moving around to the far side of them. So that way, when they do their pile-in and consolidate, their only option is to move away from the direction that I don't want them moving in.
Mm-hmm. And that's either going towards your squishy gun line or going towards objectives. All these movements that we described are available to your opponent as well. So knowing all of this, knowing all of these tricks that you can exploit, you can then, on the flip side of that, position yourself in a way to prevent that from happening in order to keep them from wiggling their way all the way to the objective and getting a hold more out of you. So I hope that was informative. We spent quite a lot of time trying to make that as easy to digest as possible and to provide as many visual and visual aids and examples to make that easy to understand. But the reality of it is that we repeated it so many times, and all of these examples are just manifestations of us just bearing down on those rules, those core rules, and just understanding the eligibility for combat, successfully charged, were themselves charged, or are within 1 inch of an enemy model, and knowing that pile-in and consolidations are the same moves, just at different times of the activation. Pile-in at the beginning, consolidate at the end, even if you didn't kill your model, and or your model's target, I should say. And it's 3 inches of movement as long as you end up closer to the closest enemy model. That's it. And the world's your oyster. Anything else to add, Alex?
No, I think the only thing I have to add is to ask everyone to stay safe and look forward to seeing you guys at tournaments once this is all over.
Can't wait to roll dice again with you, buddy.
Yep. All right.
Take
care.
Adios.